In this section, we'll learn how the three sociological paradigms discussed in Unit 1, functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism, can be applied to deviance. We'll also learn about other related theories that have been developed specifically to explain particular aspects of deviance. As you may recall, adherents of functionalism argue that each element of social structure helps maintain the stability of society. What then is the function of deviance for society? Emil Durkheim came up with a couple of functions. First, deviance can help society clarify its moral boundaries. We are reminded that our shared notions of what is right when we have to address wrongdoings of various sorts. In 2005, Terry Schiavo, a hospital patient in St. Petersburg, Florida, received national attention when a legal battle was fought over her life. Schiavo had been in a persistent vegetative state since 1990 and kept alive through a gastric feeding tube. Her husband Michael petitioned the courts in 1998 to end life support. He thought that it was the right thing to do and was what Terry would have wanted. Her parents, Mary and Robert Schindler, took legal action against Michael's decision. They thought it was wrong. While most people might have had a vague idea of how they felt about artificially prolonging life, the Schiavo case forced them to think concretely about how such choices affect actual people. After a 7-year process, the court sided with Michael Schiavo, and on March 18, 2005, his wife's feeding tube was removed. She died 13 days later. Another function of deviance is to promote social cohesion, one of functionalism's valued ideals. People can be brought together as a community in the face of crime or other violations. For example, while the country was divided over the decision in the Schiavo case, an opinion poll by ABC News on March 21, 2005 reported that 70% of Americans believed that Michael Schiavo had the authority to make decisions on behalf of his wife, that the case should not have been a federal matter. In the same poll, 63% maintained that the federal government was involved solely for political advantage. Whatever they believed about prolonging life, the majority of Americans thus agreed that the choice was best made by family and not the government. Social cohesion is central to other theories of deviance as well. Travis Hershey's social control theory hypothesizes that the stronger one's social bonds to family and religious, civic, and other groups, the less likely one is to commit crime. Such bonds tend to increase one's investment in the community and also increase one's commitment to that community's shared values and norms. With both internal and external forces regulating behavior, Hershey argues that social bonds promote conformity. Sociologist Robert Merton provides a bridge between functionalism and conflict theories of deviance. Like Durkheim, Merton acknowledges that some deviance is inevitable in society. But like conflict theorists, he argues that an individual's position in the social structure will affect his experience of deviance and conformity. Social inequality can create situations in which people experience tension or strain between the goals society says they should be working toward, like financial success, and the means they have available to meet those goals. Like not everyone is able to work hard at a legitimate job. Our society's intense emphasis on financial success and materialism through the mythology of the American dream can be stressful for those whose chances of realizing that dream are limited. The rewards of conformity are available only to those who can pursue approved goals through approved means. Any other combination of means and goals is deviant in one way or another. Innovators, for example, might seek financial success via unconventional means, such as drug dealing or embezzlement. Ritualists go through the conventional motions while abandoning all hope of success. And retreatists, like dropouts or hermits, renounce the culture's goals and means entirely and live outside the conventional norms altogether. At the far end of the continuum, rebels reject the cultural definitions of success and the normative means of achieving it and advocate radical alternatives to the existing social order. For example, consider the characters in the film The Dark Knight, an action movie that documents Batman's cleanup of Gotham City. The goal is to combat the corruption that has overcome Gotham through multiple lucrative criminal mobs. In the movie, conformity is represented by District Attorney Harvey Dent, who is attempting to fight crime through the approved means of the law. Dent, along with Police Lieutenant James Gordon and Assistant DA Rachel Dawes, enact a tough campaign to convict all mob bosses through the testimony of their accountant. Batman is an innovator who fights crime using cunning high-tech weaponry and unconventional means that ignore the legal process. As always, traditional bureaucrats like Police Commissioner Loeb and the Gotham Mayor are ritualists who operate within the parameters that they have been given with little hope of quelling the crime wave. Corrupt Officer Ramirez is a retreatist who actually helps out the mob rather than attempt to fight it. Finally, the Joker, whose portrayal by Heath Ledger won him a posthumous Academy Award, embodies the true spirit of the rebel. Rather than attempting to fight crime, the Joker causes mayhem for both law enforcers and the mob bosses associated with the ultimate goal of bringing about the downfall of all of Gotham. While the mob bosses stand to gain financially from their crime sprees, the Joker's sadistic goal is to see the entire city descend into chaos and anarchy. Conflict theorists who study inequalities of wealth and power note that inequalities are present in our definitions of deviance as well. In other words, conflict theorists believe that rules are applied unequally and that punishments for rule violators are unequally distributed. Those at the top are subject to different rules and sanctions than those nearer the bottom, and the behaviors of less powerful groups and individuals are more likely to be criminalized than the behaviors of the powerful. American criminologist Richard Quinney theorized that capitalism and the exploitation and oppression of the working class make deviant and even criminal behavior nearly inescapable for workers. The ruling class can make laws that target the poor. When the poor act out against repression, they become targets for law enforcement, while the rich and powerful remain free to do what they like. Norms, rules, and laws are used to regulate the behavior of individuals and groups. This process, known as social control, can be either informal, as in the exercise of control through customs, norms, and expectations, or formal, as in the exercise of control through laws or other official regulations. Both formal social control and informal social control can be exercised unequally in a hierarchical society, and this is what conflict theory is concerned with when it comes to the topic of deviance. As recently as 2003, more than a dozen U.S. states still imposed heterosexuality on their citizens through anti-sodomy laws, which prohibited any sexual acts that did not lead to procreation. While in theory, anti-sodomy laws could include acts by heterosexuals, in practice, these laws were generally imposed against same-sex partners. Before a Supreme Court ruling invalidated all state anti-sodomy laws in Lawrence v. Texas, sexual acts done in the privacy of your own home could be penalized with fines and jail time in states such as Florida, Idaho, and Michigan. From a conflict theory perspective, anti-sodomy laws were a way for the heterosexual majority to exercise control over same-sex minorities. As another example, the Great Recession of 2008 was in large part caused by banks engaging in risky and often predatory mortgage lending. Millions of ordinary people lost not only their homes, but also their jobs and life savings during the ensuing economic crisis, and both the national economy and global economy were on the verge of collapse. But the banks and corporations were bailed out with taxpayer money, and only a single Wall Street executive was ever prosecuted in relation to the crash. This unhappy episode in American history is just one illustration of the way that wealth and privilege protect the powerful from being defined as deviant or being punished for their violations. The recent and ongoing controversy over voter identification laws reveals how even policies that some would argue are neutral really do affect some groups differently than others. At the time of the 2016 presidential election, 12 states had a photo identification requirement for voters, meaning that voters must show a photo ID in order to cast a vote. While supporters of such laws argue that they help stem voter fraud, opponents say that the voter fraud is almost non-existent. They argue that voter ID requirements are really meant to keep various groups, ethnic and racial minorities, immigrants, the elderly, and the poor, all of whom tend to vote Democratic, away from the voting booth. These groups don't always have IDs and may have trouble getting them, especially if there is a fee involved. Unfortunately, there's a good deal of evidence to support the conflict theorist argument that the rules are applied unequally in our hierarchical society. While conflict theories and functionalists focus on inequalities and the social functions of deviance, interactionists consider the way that interpersonal relationships and everyday interactions shape definitions of deviance. One such approach is Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory, which asserts that we learn to be deviant through our interactions with others who break the rules. This is the theory of deviance that your parents subscribe to as you're a teenager. Don't hang out with the bad kids. Simple peer pressure by those who you associate with can lead to deviant behavior. For instance, an athlete who uses steroids to help build strength might also influence his teammates to start doping, even though this practice is banned in most sports. Have you ever been influenced by others to do something deviant that you would have never tried on your own? This theory of deviance seems at first glance to be pretty sensible. Interacting often with those who break the rules would seem to socialize an individual into their rule-breaking culture. But as it turns out, not all who hang out with deviants become deviant themselves, and plenty of people who engage in deviant acts have never consorted with other rule breakers. Also, in cases where deviance is not the result of a willful act, mental illness for example, a learning theory such as this one is not a useful explanation. While differential association theory seeks to explain why they do it, it cannot fully explain every case of deviant behavior, nor can any theory of deviance. Howard Becker's labeling theory proposes that deviance is not inherent in any act, belief, or condition. Instead, it's determined by the social context. A man who kills an intruder who is attacking his child may be labeled a hero, while a man who kills a cashier in the process of robbing a store may be labeled a villain. Even though the act of homicide is the same, the way the person who did it is treated differs greatly depending on the label. Labeling theory recognizes that labels will vary depending on the culture, time period, and situation. David Rosenhan's study On Being Sane in Insane Places provides a striking demonstration of the power of labeling and the importance of context. Rosenhan and 7 other researchers gained admission to psychiatric hospitals as patients. Other than falsifying their names and occupations, the 8 subjects gave honest answers to all but one of the questions in the entrance examination. They all complained of hearing voices, a symptom often linked to schizophrenia. Nevertheless, the subjects felt certain that once they were hospitalized, they would be quickly exposed as pseudo-patients, not really mentally ill. In fact, the opposite turned out to be true. Once admitted, the pseudo-patients turned immediately to the task of getting themselves discharged, and failed miserably. Although they behaved as normally and pleasantly as possible, doctors and nurses continued to treat them as mentally ill patients in need of treatment. No amount of explanation on the part of the pseudo-patients could convince the hospital staff of their sanity, though in an interesting twist, it was usually obvious to the other patients. And when they were finally discharged, after 1 to 7 weeks, it was not because the staff had finally seen through the deception. They were all released with their schizophrenia in remission. As Rosenhan concluded, once labeled schizophrenic, the pseudo-patient was stuck with that label. The effects of the sticky deviant label on actual patients can follow them through their lives, even after they leave the hospital. Labeling theory is also concerned with how individuals think of themselves once a deviant label has been applied. Recall Cooley's concept of the looking glass self. How we perceive ourselves depends in part on how others see us. So if others react to us as deviant, we're likely to internalize that label, even if we object to it. Applying deviant labels can also lead to further deviance as the person moves from primary deviance, the thing that gets her labeled in the first place, to secondary deviance, a deviant identity or career. If you've watched NBC's The Biggest Loser, you've seen examples of both types of deviance. On the show, overweight and obese contestants sign up for an intensive weight loss boot camp, and viewers follow the ups and downs of their progress over the course of each season. Their excess body weight, which is seen as deviant in contemporary U.S. culture, is an example of primary deviance, and the contestants' recognition that they are fatties who need to slim down is an example of secondary deviance. Some of the most exciting but also disturbing research on labeling theory has focused on self-fulfilling prophecy, a term coined by Robert Merton in his 1948 article of the same name. Merton's concept was derived from the so-called Thomas theorem, formulated by sociologist W.I. Thomas in 1928, which held that if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. From this theorem, Merton developed his notion of the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is basically a prediction that causes itself to come true merely by being stated. He offered the example of a bank in the Depression-era 1930s that collapsed through a rumor of insolvency when enough investors became convinced that the bank was out of money. Merton argued that the self-fulfilling prophecy can be used to explain some racial and ethnic issues in the United States, and subsequent research has borne him out. Stereotypes are often a part of the self-fulfilling prophecies. Claude Steele's research on stereotype threat shows that when students worry that their own poor academic performance could unintentionally confirm the negative stereotype of their social group, they actually perform poorly, thus confirming the stereotype. Stereotype threat has been measured in high-achieving African American students as well as highly ranked female math students. Stereotypes and self-fulfilling prophecies are not always negative. Jennifer Lee and Min Zhao found that Asian American students can actually benefit from both. In the case of stereotype promise, Asian American students are more likely to be placed in advanced placement classes, receive high grades, and be treated well by teachers because others assume that they are high achievers. In both cases, the stereotypes become real as people act based on them, even in cases where students are trying to avoid this very problem. Labels alone are not 100% deterministic, and prophecies are not always self-fulfilling. But in our society, deviant labels can override other aspects of individual identity and exert a powerful influence on self-image, treatment by others, and even social and institutional policies. In ancient Greece, criminals and slaves were branded with hot irons, making a mark called a stigma, from the Greek word for tattoo. The stigma was meant to serve as an outward indication there was something shameful about the bearer, and to this day we continue to use the term to signify some disgrace or failing. Although we no longer live in a society where we're forced to wear our rule violations branded onto our bodies, stigmatized identities still carry serious social consequences. Stigma, a central concept in the sociology of deviance, was analyzed and elaborated by Erving Goffman in his book of the same name. Once an individual has been labeled as deviant, he is stigmatized and acquires what Goffman calls a spoiled identity. And there are three main types of stigma. Physical, and that includes physical or mental impairments. Moral, signs of a flawed character. And tribal, membership in a discredited or oppressed group. Almost any departure from the norm can have a stigmatizing effect, including a physical disability, a past battle with alcohol or mental illness, time served in jail, or sexual transgressions. Goffman recognizes that what may once have been a stigmatized identity may change over time or may vary according to the cultural or social context. Being black or Jewish is a stigma only if one lives in a racist or anti-Semitic society. In a community entirely populated by African Americans, it is white people who may be stigmatized, and all Jewish enclave may see non-Jews as outside the norm. Goffman is careful to note that not all stigmatized identities are just or deserved, only that they are specific to the norms and prejudices of a particular group, time period, or context.